lots of the archaeology and archaeologists who drove gender archaeology were studying and writing about indigenous contexts which are not part of my gender experience. And I think while there are meaningful parallels we can talk about, it's not my place to kind of talk, I'm from a different community is what I'm trying to say, and it's not necessarily my place to pass judgment on terminologies being used in those circumstances, and I don't want to be seen to be advocating for using those terms outside of that context. It also means I'm going to miss various things. Also, I speak English, a tiny bit of Welsh and not much else. I am using sources that have been translated by other people for me, and then I've gone back and checked key terms. But again, bear that in mind that this talk is going to be mainly about terms used in English language publications. Otherwise, they have been translated. So secondly, I grew up lower middle class, although I definitely now consider myself middle class. And that means that I have a certain positionality within the trans community. For example, I am just about able to afford a certain level of HRT that meets my minimum needs. And that's important because it means my experience of transness is not the same as other people's experience of transness. And that means when I'm reading sources and I'm looking at burials and I'm studying material culture, I might see transness in a way that people with other experience of being trans don't. And that's why any kind of trans studies, any kind of studies at all, needs people from across different backgrounds, because something that's obvious to me might not be obvious to somebody else, and something that's obvious to somebody else might not be obvious to me. And as I just alluded to there, I am trans, I am non-binary, but I'm not, as far as I'm aware, and I certainly don't claim to be a part of the intersex community. Now, I will be talking about the intersex community in this presentation because it's a term that comes up in archaeology, but I'm talking about that community as an outsider, and again, I want to flag that. It's a term that needs to be talked about in the context of archaeology, but it's not my lived experience. And in relation to archaeology, I like my archaeology post-processual, new Marxist, and most of all transformative. If you know Ian Hodder, everything he's against. And that's what I'm going for here. So secondly, before we begin this talk about labels and terminology, I think it's important to talk about what's in a label. Specifically, I'm going to kind of be passing judgment on labels, and I want to just put it out there that whatever label you use or want to use, that's fine. That's your label if you're using it for yourself. I don't want to be seen to be saying some labels are more valid than others. My point is some labels might be less useful in archaeological context than others for wider readership. Which is a little slice there. And the reason that's important is because at the last check, the non-binary wiki, pulling data from the 2019 gender census, listed over 136 different English language gender labels. There's a selection of some of them up there and related flags. And as I said, if any of these labels or any other labels fit you, it's no one's place to say that label is incorrect, and it's certainly not what my talk is about. My talk is about labels within archaeology and how they are understood and used within the discipline, not the labels as of themselves. And the other thing that makes labels really interesting and why using labels in archaeology is so fraught and difficult is because most of these labels are very similar, but they are subtly distinct. They broadly overlap, but in basically every instance, it's impossible to quantify or really define outside of personal embodiment and trans phenomenology. And that makes it quite hard for archaeology because, and trust me, I've tried, trust me, I'm trans doesn't really work as a citation. You kind of have to launder it through a few different processes. So that's something to bear in mind, that identities are not prescriptivist. They are what they mean to the individual. And so I just want to say that throughout this talk, I will primarily be using both the terms trans and intersex in the broadest sense that they are used by their participatory communities. And effectively that means I'm always giving primacy to self-identification and not prescriptivism. So when I say trans offhand or intersex offhand, take that to mean anybody who claims that label for whatever reason. And we're not going into the nuances of the debates within that, partly because I think that's a defeatist attitude. Just let anybody who wants to claim those labels claim those labels. And moreover, because I just think it means that the discussion that we're going to have is going to be more interesting, because it's going to be about the discongruence that can happen when you try to apply strict definitions or try to talk about things in definitive terms when we're doing something as broad as gender. So with those disclaimers out the way, and hopefully you'll get a sense of what we're getting into now. We're going to begin in 1984 and the year zero for gender archaeology. Now, if you've read your gender archaeology, you'll know that in 1984, Margaret Conkey and Janet Spector published Archaeology and the Study of Gender in Advances in Archaeological Method and Theory. Now, this is a foundational paper in gender archaeology. It's not the first paper in what could be called broadly gender archaeology. I mean, you've got Woman the Hunter, Woman the Gatherer, sorry, as a direct response to Man the Hunter, that was published, a book published a few years earlier, and other people are kind of broadly mentioning gender, but effectively this is the ground zero document, the document that kind of births gender and feminist archaeology, and it really can't be overstated. And if you've not read it and you're doing any kind of gender in history, it's worth a read. It is a little dated, being now, I can do the maths, 46 years old. I think, yeah, 46 years old, but 42, thank you. It's a bit outdated being 42 years old, but it holds merit and it's really important. In fact, it's so important that Sandra Holloman declared that archaeology can be split into two. Oh, why has that gone into two things? There we go. Two periods, before gender and after gender, around this work. So consider this the year zero BG AG, and that's what I'm going to do for the rest of this talk. So most of the dates you're going to see from now on in are related to 1984, because I think archaeology needs yet another point zero for dating. And so with that, we can begin with our first series of paper. Now, the last thing I want to say before I get into the papers is most of these papers are good and use bad or questionable terms, but have some archaeological merit. Some of these papers are bad, quite bad. It will become apparent as I'm talking about them how I feel about them. But do not consider a reference to a specific paper, or in some cases an individual archaeologist's several papers, as me passing any kind of judgment. It's not inherently bad to be in this list, right? Terminology's changed and people are writing within the history and the means and the society that they are writing in. On occasion, some of them are bad. I will mention that, don't worry. So we're going to begin in the year 15 BG. With Mannish Housewifes. This is one of those instances where the paper is questionable. So we're going to go further back to about the year 984 BG. So that's 1100 AD. And the Swantaka individual is buried in Västernorrmäki in Swantaka, southern Finland. It's quite a rich grave, and they were found actually by the digging of a water pipe. That's what the takdike is. And they were found in 1968, and the next day, Oiva Keskitalo, a prominent Finnish archaeologist went over and excavated the burial and found a rich assortment of grave goods, including 2 swords. The reason that's questioned is some people think it might be from a different cut. There's like a whole debate around it. It's not particularly important to our presentation today. Worth mentioning though, and several items of jewellery and traditional feminine dress. What's also quite nice is later study has shown that there was feathers found in the soil underneath, and it was suggested that they were laid to rest on feather bedding, which I just think is quite a sweet little detail. So if you know your gender archaeology, and we're 15 BG, gender hasn't been invented yet. We're 15 years before gender exists. So what do you think a bunch of predominantly male archaeologists, in the case of Oiva Keskitalo, a male archaeologist, did when they were like, we got a female grave and 2 swords? They panicked, because those things don't really go together. There's one other example in Finland at this time of a female skeleton with 2 swords, right? And so they kind of come up with lots of different possibilities. So one of the ones that's argued for is that, okay, well, actually, this is a double burial, but the skeleton of the man, that's eroded away. All that's left of the man is the swords, everything else is the woman. Don't worry about it, definitely a double burial, probably a double burial, maybe a double burial. Spoiler alert, later analysis through archaeotoponymy has shown it almost certainly isn't a double burial. So that was one of the things that was mooted as a possibility. And the other possibility was that this person is a mannhaftige Hausfrau, or a mannish housewife, somebody who is, for whatever reason, buried in feminine dress, but is definitely like mannish because of the swords. And the other possible interpretation that Keskakarlo does, writes it in his conclusion, is this person might be akin to Louhi from the Kalevalas, which is kind of like the Finnish epic poem. Louhi is like a goddess of the underworld, pretty cool person, definitely would have reason to have swords. So we see 15 years before gender exists, we're interpreting a burial that doesn't fit a strict binary norm as, you know, it's something weird. It's a Mannish housewife. It's a potential deity figure. And yeah, that's kind of the beginning we're going from. And it doesn't get much better because we then get warriors in women's clothes, which is a term which is introduced in reference to several burials, two burials, I should say, from Stuttgart-Bad Cannstatt, which is a late Hallstatt period burial assortment. We get two burials in this area, which contained both feminine grave ornaments and spear points. That's an example of spear point. It's not one from the burial. And Pauli, who is writing about this, of course, goes, aha, well, women don't have spears. Impossible. Can't happen. Everyone knows this. So clearly we have Kriegen mit, I'm going to apologize for my German here, Kriegen mit weiblichen Traktabuten, or warriors in female costume, warriors with female attributes, right? And so again, when we get this instance where we have a burial in which we find a mismatch of gendered items that are gendered by archaeologists, I should be saying, then the only framework we have before gender is invented in 12 BG is that these are clearly some kind of, well, I don't want to put terms in these people's mouths because they're using German language, but effectively what other people have later translated these works as cross-dressers. And that's really the only way that these burials can be interpreted. So whenever we have gender incongruent burials, this is the immediate interpretation. And I think we can all agree that that terminology is not great. Like, I don't think it's really adding anything to the archaeological record, not least because it's completely sexist. Even if we step aside from looking at trans and non-binary and intersex people in the archaeological record, if this is your only way of looking at weaponry and female grave ornamentation, you're probably sexist. Do better. I'm not saying that to anyone in the room directly, but it's just worth knowing. But fear not, because also if there isn't any weapons in your female grave, that might also be an issue. So we're in 1 BG, 1983, on the cusp of gender, but we're not quite there yet. And we've got the Princess of Vix, a very famous burial, a very rich burial. And Spindler is interpreting this burial as a priest. It can't be a princess, it must be a priest, because the richness of the grave precludes that it could be a woman. Again, not a great argument, but the terminology, well, it's not a great argument because it's a terrible argument, but the terminology being used is interesting. Again, Spindler is writing in German. I have had this translated, but I've then gone back and looked up key terms as well, just to double check. And Spindler uses this term, zwischenhaftes, which can mean hermaphroditic or hybrid in nature. I think he's like exact translation is like for the day, but in context, it just means that this person is, in his view, potentially a hermaphrodite or hybrid in nature, and importantly, not averse to wearing women's clothes. He actually is, he even ends that point with an exclamation point. He basically says, yeah, priests wear women's clothes all the time, brackets, cassocks, close bracket, exclamation point. He really wanted to drive home that point. So what I'm trying to get through here is we've got a bit of a mess. Right, terms in the late 70s, well, in the late 60s, 70s, and early 80s are a bit of a mess, right? Because they are hamstrung by this idea that there is a binary sex and that any kind of crossing it must be to do with, because, you know, some kind of priestly role, it must be to do with some kind of cross-dressing idea. There's no debate, there's no discussion, there's no terminology being deployed by these archaeologists which might explain what is going on through words related to communities that we understand today as trans, as non-binaries, intersex. And that doesn't mean these people definitely were. It doesn't mean they weren't. It just means that the language being used is not great, and you might come across it if you're reading sources from this period. And if you want to talk about the Princess of Vix, and look, even if you agree that this Princess of Vix might be a male person, a male skeleton buried with female grave goods, if you want to go with that interpretation, maybe don't use these terminologies, maybe look at what other terms you can use, which is what we'll get onto later. So, next year, gender is discovered. Hooray. That doesn't mean things get immediately better. They start improving. So one of the things I have to talk about here is when gender archaeology kind of gets introduced, its main proponents and main immediate uptakers are kind of mostly involved in indigenous archaeology or archaeology of indigenous communities. And as far as I'm aware, not many of them are themselves indigenous. And therefore, they start talking a lot about third genders. They see the discovery of gender and they go, great, we finally have a framework in which we can talk about third gender communities in native culture. Now, third gender was the English common phraseology used in anthropology and beyond for indigenous genders beyond male and female. But in 1990, Two-Spirit was coined by indigenous people as the English language equivalency at their third annual Inter-Tribal Native American First Nation Gay and Lesbian American Conference. But Two-Spirit doesn't really get picked up until much later. Archaeologists in the 1990s are primarily using third gender. And there's a volume that's published, it's edited by Vold and Vella, it's Archaeology and Gender, and most of the papers in that, and then at the Chakmal Gender Conference the next year, this is 1991, this is kind of holds a lot of papers to do with indigenous archaeology and the early stages of gender archaeology, and it's well worth a read. There's lots of good papers in it. Some of them don't use great language. Usually they use third gender as a term. Occasionally they use other terminology. Sometimes these are terms taken from indigenous communities and applied to indigenous communities, and we give that a big thumbs up. Other times it's not that, and we give that a thumbs down. But I think the important thing to note here is Duke's comment. So Philip Duke is writing in this volume, and he pointedly remarks that archaeology runs the risk, again, of using the past of other peoples to make political statements relevant to its practitioners. Because this kind of understands that gender archaeology is more than just about understanding the past. It's about talking about gender in the present through the past. That is the big feminist critique in gender archaeology, and I think it's a core part of gender archaeology. And Duke is warning, which Wally expounds in 2022, although others have written in between, that effectively using third gender, using Two-Spirit, using indigenous labels and understanding for their gender systems is very good in that community. But we run the risk if we lift those labels and apply them elsewhere. And that's, I think, something we need to bear in mind. And that's why I positioned myself at the beginning as white Welsh and I would be a settler colonial, because the archaeology that I'm doing, I'd love if somebody from an indigenous community came along and said, great, we have some of that framework, but a lot of it doesn't apply, or they wanted to go their own way with it. That's not my place to go. And really, my only bit of advice, if you're talking about indigenous communities, is work with indigenous communities and just be wary of what exact terminologies you're using, because third gender and third gender is a little bit out of favor. Two-Spirit is a broad catch-all term. There are lots of good resources online, and I'm sure would be shared with you if you're working with an indigenous community about what specific kind of label they use for members in their society who exist beyond male and female as designations, and you should always give primacy to using those. Right, so moving on, we had a bit of a good thing. Now we're going to go to a little bit of a, well, not so great one. Transvestites and honorary males. I say not so great. This is another example where Bettina Arnold, right, is brilliant. Her archaeology on gender is really, really quite something. I've had the pleasure of doing work with them, a conference presentation with them, and their paper, Honorary Males, from 1995, is a must read. It absolutely hits the nail on the head. And she kind of uses the term a little bit ironically to basically say, like, anytime we get a rich female grave, this means it's a woman with power, therefore are they an honorary male? It's kind of like a tongue-in-cheek feminist critique of this idea. Think the Barbie movie, where that one side character says, I'm a man with no power, does that make me a woman? It's kind of like that kind of tongue-in-cheek feminist critique. Nonetheless, it's still an important term to note that if incongruous burials are being discussed through the lens of an honorary male, what we have there is a burial in which we've got a female skeleton or a skeleton assigned a female sex osteologically and male grave goods. But the other thing is, Arnold is the one that introduced the term transvestite into archaeology, which other people have used. Now, the reason I say it's Arnold who introduced this is because Arnold actually references Pauli and Spindler, you know, the priests and their love of feminine cassocks and the warrior women. And she directly translates that as transvestites. Now, as far as I'm aware, the German term for transvestite is Transvestit, and that does not appear in any of those publications. This is an active choice on behalf of Arnold. But I'll give Arnold a little bit of slack there, because actually at the period she was writing and translating these documents, that was kind of the predominant term for members outside of the community, and even some within the community, for understanding. I'm looking at here Peter Ackroyd's Transvestism and Drag, A History of the Obsession. Very weird book. He says it's very painful to be a transvestite. They have to shave their finger hair. How painful. It's a wild read, honestly. 1970s was a time to be alive. But the point is, in choosing to use the translation, or in choosing to use the term transvestite, Arnold becomes one of the first archaeologists to really take a contemporary socio-political, socio-sexual identity and apply it to people from the past. And that has all sorts of issues we'll get onto later. But it does present a meaning, right? You can kind of broadly understand. You know, I had to go through and dig up specific quotes from Spindler and from Pauli, which kind of give the essence that he's talking, or that they're talking about individuals we might today call people who are presenting in a sex or a gender different to that they're assigned at birth. It becomes quite unwieldy to say. And this is another reason why modern labels are used. It becomes shorthand. People are more familiar with understanding what these are without necessarily having to find the nuance of specific love for cassocks, for example. But that doesn't mean we should probably be using transvestite as a term today. It does occasionally crop up in the 1990s and early 2000s. But I think we can agree we've kind of moved on. I've talked about this in the wrong order, but we have touched on honorary males, which again is kind of a tongue-in-cheek feminist critique of the idea the only way a woman could be buried with power is to be an honorary male. But it does give an interesting framework nonetheless. So now moving on, we get to the confusing bisexuals. It's not that bisexuals are confusing, but in archaeology and the way they crop up in relation to gender is a bit confusing. That's why there's a star here, because we're not really talking about bisexuals as a sexuality. That's not what gender archaeology did in the 1990s. So, and again, this is another chapter that like holds up even today, other than its like rogue use of the term bisexual. The actual chapter by Tim Yates is really, really good and hits a lot of nails on the head and kind of calls out 1990s archaeology for being homophobic, many of which criticisms might still be prescient today. In relation to other topics, I'm thinking trans archaeology in particular, which gets a lot of bad press from some sectors within archaeology. But Tim Yates's paper is really, really good, other than for what he falls into what I call the sex trap, which is kind of the conflation of sex and gender, or sexuality and gender. And this leads to a rather fun sentence in which basically Tim Yates says, if we're talking about how society makes gender, the male child is thus fundamentally bisexual. And I did have to read that a few times, because at first I was like, are they? Ooh, fun. New bisexual flag just dropped. But no, what Tim Yates means by this is that the propensity for people to assume one of two binary genders is not inherent to the material conditions of their birth, it's culturally created. And that's a really good argument. And this is what I mean. There's loads of papers, older papers, that are just hitting nails on the head the whole time, and occasionally misstriking with a little bit of a confusing term. yeah, so it still periodically appears in this context. If you're reading sources, it appears in Burmeister's 2003 work on the late Hallstatt period, which is brilliantly called the Herr der Ringe, or the Lord of the Rings. I didn't think I'd get to cite the term bisexual from the Lord of the Rings. It's a different Lord of the Rings, but I'm taking it. And moving on from bisexuals, we have homosexuals, the next natural step. So it's 9 AG, 1994, and Kenneth Matthews basically comes along and proposes that gender incongruent burials, these burials that have mixed attributions of sex and gender, are perhaps homosexual individuals, right? And he makes this claim very firmly, again, several years later in 2001, where he basically says burials will allow us to find homosexuals. Because, and I kid you not, gay men obviously will be buried with their sex toys and other homoerotic artifacts, and therefore there is a material culture of homosexuality that archaeology can find. And one of the material cultures, aside from the ridiculous sex toys remark, and that's, I'm summarizing there, but he does publish sex toys in his list of things that might identify male homosexual burials. Another thing is that mixing of gender and sex attributions in the burial. And I don't think I need to tell you that perhaps talking about gender through the lens of they're all homosexuals is not really what we need to be doing nowadays. But again, because no bad paper is without a good bit of stuff, he occasionally hits really prescient nails on the head, and again talks about how archaeology erases queer identities. That's his ending argument, and it is a good one. So credits where credit's due. I'm going to have a sip of my tea now. So now we're in 16 AG. And Newsell and Ripley use all the terms. I started listing all the terms that they use in their one paper at the top of this slide, and I couldn't fit them all in. So I'm going to introduce them one by one. And this is where I'm going to do the content warning again. It is in this paper we do get a pejorative for two-spirit people, which I will be mentioning because it's important to the paper and the history of terminologies. I'm just flagging that up there now. So they basically look back, I'm imagining now, they look back on all the transvestite priests, all the warriors in women's clothing, all the confused bisexual and homosexual people, and they go, what our gender archaeology needs is more terms. Not necessarily useful terms, but more terms. And they're particularly talking about Anglo-Saxon burials, which is why it makes so much sense that they decide to use the term berdash, which is a pejorative for two-spirit people in native communities. And they go, yeah, they write a paper that basically says the Anglo-Saxon berdash, or the man-woman of Anglo-Saxon England. And it doesn't really make sense. And also they do acknowledge that it's an offensive term and then put it in their title anyway. And I was getting ready when I was writing this up, because it was like about a year since I last read this paper in full before I read it for this presentation, to go, right, here we go, I'm going to launch into some scathing criticism now. And then the paper just has 8 paragraphs that are pretty brilliant. I was like, Newsell, Ripley, why? So again, I think there's a lot that can be criticized about this paper, and we'll touch upon it. But do bear in mind, as is the case with, I think, when you're dealing with gender archaeology, is that to even try and talk about beyond the binary genders in this period is a step in the right direction. And we can certainly critique and judge certain terms, but we must acknowledge they're at least trying, and therefore there might be something of merit in their papers. So if you're reading a gender archaeology paper and it's quite out of date, there's probably something in there that's quite useful. And also, as Moyne summarizes in 2019, no one else has really read them other than other gender archaeologists. So archaeology is still probably about 40 years out of date. So you can use any paper you want from that period because it's still going to be new to some people. Anyway, aside there, so they instead they acknowledge the dangers of this word. So they use man woman, which is not great. I'm not going to lie. Certainly wouldn't like anyone to describe any member of my community as a man woman. And I don't think it kind of works in the context of archaeology. For a start, man and woman both have complex terms that also don't translate one-to-one into the past. So to use them in such a setting kind of is just a bit, it doesn't really work. It conjures an image that isn't particularly useful or helpful. And there are other ways of kind of saying it. And again, I think the issue also leads with the fact that they lead with man. They talk exclusively about men women, not women men. Like, if that would make it any better, I don't know, but it would at least acknowledge this idea that effectively we're still wrapped up in this concept that if a burial is ambiguous in gender, that individual must have either been a woman gaining the power of a man or a man losing the power of a man by becoming more feminine. I think that's built into this term. But then they have those 8 really good paragraphs where they basically say we could also include intersex people in this category of ambiguous graves. And they do talk about intersex communities for a couple of paragraphs in a way that basically says archaeology has really failed the intersex community. It hasn't acknowledged their existence. It's written them out of history. And again, we give them a thumbs up for this. And they suggest that one way of possibly finding intersex individuals is to look for these ambiguous burials where you've got, for example, feminine grave goods and a male skeleton, or male grave goods and a feminine skeleton. And Westman takes this up in 2005 as part of their master's thesis, I believe. And it's not inherently a problematic way to look. Like, I'm not going to say that obviously incongruent burials equal intersex or that they don't. It's just they are correct. Archaeology has overlooked the intersex community, and we probably should be thinking of ways that we can talk about them in history, because they obviously existed, right? Just as all genders and all sexualities and sexes have obviously existed in the past, intersex people have obviously existed too. And then they also say transgender individuals, and this is an explicit use of the term transgender, which really hasn't appeared in archaeology before. We've had transvestites, we've occasionally had transsexuals, but transgender hasn't. Other than in Conky and Spector, who, because their work is brilliant, basically say, oh yeah, the existence of trans people today proves they existed in the past. We should look into that, guys. Come on, there's a whole thing here. And Newson and Ripley basically say, yeah, archaeology again, it's ignored this entire community. There's lots of possibilities here. Let's look into that. But they also, for all that good, can't quite escape the idea that men just like wearing cassocks and to feel feminine and priestly. So they also potentially suggest that any ambiguous graves are sacrados. I'm doing a little bit of paraphrasing here, but you get the gist. So it's one of those papers that is, if you do choose to read it, you're going to like highlight half of it to quote like as a yes, and highlight half of it to quote as a no. It's a marmite of papers, but they throw in lots of new terms into the discussion. And one of the terms they don't really use is non-binary, but we only have to wait 1 year. 1 year. In 2001, Sandra Holloman, who is great, basically comes along and says, okay, right, the term third gender isn't really working because for several reasons we're still linking it to binary sex categories. We're effectively kind of arguing that the third gender is, well, third in line of genders you want to be, because we've also still got androcentrism, which makes being male better. So there's a little bit of critique of androcentrism in this switch that Holloman goes from talking about native communities and beyond the binary genders from third gender to non-binary. And she basically argues that, you know, non-binary is a better model, a better term to use for genders beyond male and female, because it doesn't kind of come with that inherent ranking or that inherent being the third and therefore the worst or the smallest or whatever. And she doesn't adopt two-spirit, but I put it in here, and effectively argues that because contemporary societies include two-spirit people in California, which is where she does most of her archaeology, that probably is an older gender system for the first people to move into the area, and therefore they will probably show up archaeologically. And she publishes several papers since 2001 with this framework, and they're all definitely pretty strong. Because again, I actually think her use of the term non-binary, while she's not using it in the same socio-sexual understanding that many Western people use non-binary, it's actually a pretty, I think in this instance, it does sort of what it needs to do. It acknowledges we're not talking about male or females, and it acknowledges we're not talking about a lesser demographic just because they're a third. The one thing she does say, though, and she criticizes herself and others, is that she does warn that we risk non-binary becoming something of a trash can category for any burial we can't immediately sex or gender as male or female. And so while I'll say non-binary is a pretty good term, for discussing these burials. In some ways, we do have to be careful that we're not just kind of using it as a way of, I don't immediately understand this burial in a Western binary gender system, it's non-binary, right? It might be, doesn't mean it has to be. And equally, it also runs the risk, if we only give non-binary designations to mismatched burials, it runs the risk of any matched burials having their gender immediately assumed as well. Now, non-binary continues, because again, as I said, Holloman is great. And she gets a bit of criticism. Everyone's like, oh yeah, but non-binaries are such a small part of the community, of the population. How are you going to find them? And she retorts brilliantly, look, archaeology is all about finding rare people. We just call them the elite, which I just think, chef's kiss. It's a brilliant criticism because it's true. There's no reason why it should be harder to find a person who is non-binary or beyond the binary in any way than it is to find, you know, any other kind of minority community or elite community. Now, non-binary goes on a little bit of a hiatus from archaeology, but Miller Power comes in 2022. They're a genderqueer writer. They're writing from within the non-binary community. And the way that they frame it effectively is that we need to understand non-binary as a discursive category. It's not prescriptivist. It doesn't specifically relate to any individual community. It doesn't specifically relate to any kind of composition of burial or composition of record of an individual's life, but it relates to any gender that you kind of want it to, again, giving primacy to that individual. Definitions are going to start becoming looser as we get more recent, because most recent work in gender archaeology kind of adopts what Giffney calls archaeology, queer theories, like to fully understand, we just kind of need to like get a point across and we can revel in that uncertainty. But 29 AD, and we get transgender people. So, as I mentioned before, transgender as a term in archaeology is actually introduced in the year zero as kind of evidence that, you know, we need a non-binary understanding of gender because trans people exist. Conky Inspector coming in hot. But it wouldn't be until 2013 that the field we would really call Transgender Archaeology Day comes about. And this is Mary Westmantel's infamous paper, A Queer Rampage Through Prehistory, towards a transgender archaeology. And this is from Miller Power's paper, because Power also talks about trans stuff, and I think it's quite funny, and it hits the nail on the head that one of the main things transgender archaeology does, and one of the main reasons that transgender becomes a term used in archaeology, is to make a link between past people and present people, regardless of if they are trans themselves, how we'd understand it. It's to make that terse, to basically argue against this idea that trans people are modern, that our community is some kind of novel newcomer to the scene. And basically, as Westmantel points out, if you erase trans people from history, you erase trans people today, and it's a form of structural violence. So Westmantel and others since have acknowledged that transgender might not be the best term, and it might not be how these individuals in prehistory actually would call themselves if they're around today, but there are sufficient meaningful parallels that to not use the term equates to erasing history of trans people today. And others have gone forward with this. Power, as I mentioned, but Leo Colwell, James Davison, and I've used it myself because it's a term that I like within archaeology. And then we move on to intersex as a term that appears again. Now, we talked about intersex earlier with Newson and Ripley and Vestman, but they primarily use it as a gender rather than a sex. And what I mean by this is they basically view intersex as a gender category that your outward presentation can make you part of the in-group. Now, as I said, I'm not intersex, and I'm not going to talk about how intersex people choose to view themselves or their community, because, again, I'm an outsider. But we do see a shift in 2017 where archaeology starts viewing intersex not as a gender, but as a sex, and a readable sex at that. It's measurable through traits, such as chromosomes. So the Hartborough Barrier is where this is done first, although actually Redfern et al. Published a correction 6 years later that says their chromosomal analysis was inaccurate and the person is not intersex. But Malina et al. With the Swantaka individual basically says that person is characteristically intersex. They have XXY chromosomes. And we start seeing very contemporary archaeology papers publishing this idea that intersex is a measurable identity, but they do frame it as a DSD, or a developmental sex disorder, which a lot of people in the intersex community would completely disagree with. And it becomes an interesting one, because Newton and Ripley in 2000 were right. Archaeology has ignored intersex people, but intersex is a category that is potentially measurable by archaeologists. How can we do that whilst also not pathologizing intersex? That's a question I think an intersex archaeologist really has to answer. I don't have the answers, not being in that community, but it is something I want to highlight, that you'll probably see intersex used in archaeology, the term used in more recent archaeological papers, and when you do, it's talking about measurable sex, not gender. Indeed, Malinen basically says the Swantaka person was karyotypically intersex, but potentially had a non-binary gender. So we see these terms conflate, and obviously intersex people can be non-binary, and some non-binary people are intersex, but they don't mean they always exist together. So the last term I want to talk about before I move on to some concluding thoughts is gender diverse. Right, this is a term that I think a lot of people were probably using offhand, or at talks and presentations, because it kind of flows nicely. But the first time I actually saw it published was by Berry in 2022. And when they're discussing Old North gender systems, we've come back to Swantaka, and also BJ 581, which is a Burqa burial. If you don't know about the Burqa debacle, it's a whole thing. It's quite interesting. Basically, yeah, it became a warrior woman, and then a whole lot of other stuff went on about it. And somebody accused the experts of losing the bones, to which they then published a supplementary material with a picture of every individual bone labeled BJ 581 from the 1800s to prove that they've not lost them and they were using the original, a whole thing. But Berry basically argues that instead of using any of these previous terms that have a lot of loaded meaning and have connotations to specific contemporary identities, or are just slurs, or are just confusing, we should instead favor other terms such as gender diverse and gender deviation. And that is the term that they use throughout their papers. And indeed, Anastasiadio, which is one of the papers that talk about intersex individuals in archaeology, when they talk about that in relation to gender, when they try and gender these people they've sexed as intersex, they use similar language using the term gender variation. So it's 42 AG now. Where do we go? So one of the things I think is important to mention, and why I wanted to go through all these terms, is it is often said that using contemporary queer labels for the distant past is historically inaccurate. Pamela Geller published this. They've said similar things. Again, Pamela Geller is somebody whose work holds a lot of merit, and you should definitely read. And I have some, sympathy for that argument. However, one of the things you've got to realise is that actually, we still need to be able to describe identities throughout all of human history that are beyond male or female. And I think to denounce using contemporary terms because they're historically inaccurate is actually binary in of itself. And moreover, these terms actually are older than you think. I've got on here a screenshot from Thomas Blount's Glossographia of 1652 with 2 words for trans people: transection and transfeminate. So this is the second ever English language dictionary published, and we've got 2 terms for trans people, literally to turn from from woman to man, or from one sex to another, right there in black and white. So actually, not only do we have documented evidence of trans and non-binary people for far longer than people give credit for, but actually the terminology exists for almost as long as the modern English language has existed. And they probably existed at the time the first dictionary was written, they just weren't written down. Thomas Blount gloats how there's like 500 extra words in this new dictionary because his dictionary is the best. Also, there's lots of Bible stuff in there. It's a fun read if you like old dictionaries. But yeah, so where we go from now is basically to acknowledge that yes, there might be some historical inaccuracy, although not in all periods, because these terms are older than we give them credit for. But B, we still need a lexicon, right? It's one thing to say we can't use these terms that are historically inaccurate. Well, then what terms do you want to use? Because we can't not use the terms. As Westmantel says, that's a form of structural violence. We're erasing identities, and we're restricting the kind of archaeology we can talk about to binaries that, depending on who you want to believe, didn't exist until the Bronze Age, or and even then only in certain communities and stuff like that. So we will conclude, however, by following on from that, by basically saying that we do need a lexicon. What lexicon can we use? And I'm going to offer some ideas here, and also note that they all still have issues. So non-binary is a pretty good one. I've explained how Holloman used it and how Power used it, and I think it gets the message across that we're talking about people who aren't male or female, and we're not placing them at a lower rung of the gender ladder. However, it does have links to contemporary socio-political connotations, and these links are not necessarily applicable to all societies. For example, being non-binary today means being illegal in the eyes of the UK government. It doesn't necessarily mean that non-binary people in prehistory were viewed similarly by their communities. And moreover, it asks what binary, right? What if we're talking about a society that didn't have a gender binary? Then what use is the term non-binary? Everyone is non-binary. And similarly with gender diverse, which I think is a perfectly apt term to use, it begs the question, diverse to what gender system? Are we talking about a person in prehistory who is diverse to our contemporary Western gender system, or diverse within their own gender system? And how are we going to quantify that? Or are they both? And are they both in different ways? And beyond the binary, which is the term that I use, I think it's the one with the least issues, but it still has issues. Again, what binary are we talking about? Is it of our time? Is it of both times? And what if it's a different kind or of beyond, right? What if they are beyond our binary today and beyond their binary, but the binaries themselves are different, and therefore it just opens a whole can of worms. And these are things you have to think about when using terms, because again, we need a lexicon, and all of them are going to have issues. So I'm going to end now with some initial steps that we can make acknowledging all of that. So first of all, I think when you're publishing, always state your positionality and whether you're within or without the transgender or intersex community. I'm not saying that you have to be trans or intersex to talk about these communities, but you really have to say if you're in them or if you're without them. It doesn't make your work worth any less or any more, but it will be a primer for people so they can understand, and especially for those within the community. And it kind of gives you that, shows embodied knowledge of what you're talking about and why you've interpreted things in such a way, which I think is a really useful step. A famous example of why interpretation matters like that is, I can't pronounce their names because they're old, they're Middle Egyptian, but that very famous tomb of two supposed male lovers. Their iconography shows them in a very loving way. And basically everyone in the 1980s was like, brothers or twins. And then a gay man basically said, well, they could be, not saying they're not, but have we considered love? And I think that's important because it really shows why you're making that argument. And it allows people to potentially have different takes to you, even within and wanting the same emancipation for queer identities and use of archaeology to do so. So the other thing you should do is define your key gender terms up front. Now, I didn't do this because I was talking about like 20 different gender terms, but if you're using gender terms in your analysis, define them and what exactly you mean by them, including the issues that arise from them and why, notwithstanding, you've still chosen to use them. And this applies to men and women as well, if you're using those terms, because an Anglo-Saxon man probably has a lot of very similar parallels to a contemporary man, but not all of them are the same. That's still a category. It's still a modern term, or we understand the term through a modern lens that we're applying to the past people. So even if you're writing about, or you're not planning to touch upon non-binary or beyond the binary burials or individuals, define what you mean by man and woman and why, and the limitations. It's important. It shows that gender is always going to be individual and is always going to be, there's always going to be an issue when applying it to the past because of contemporary understandings of these terms. And lastly, if we're talking about measurable traits, be as specific as you can, because gender should be broad and as open as it needs to be. But if you're talking about specific measurable traits, be specific. For example, if you've done a chromosomal analysis and found that somebody is chromosomally male, right? They are karyotypically male, right? It means that typically you would associate these chromosomes with that sex. Doesn't mean that this person related to it, or we could talk about sex assigned, designated, or estimated archaeologically. It doesn't mean that this person was, it just means that by traditional archaeological methods and using traditional archaeological measurements, we have assigned this gender or this sex onto them. And that's kind of what I want to end you with today. There will be time for the questions because I've timed this almost perfectly. But yes, so thank you very much. Hopefully that's given you a little insight into all the terms that there has been and the terms that we can go on to, and has shown you some of the more interesting ones and ones that we can adopt, ones that we can ignore, but also how to navigate older papers that will use these terms in such a way that you can understand them and glean the important messages that most of them are choosing, most of them are trying to say.
That was absolutely brilliant, and I'm slightly jealous of the hand-holding bullet points. I want to know where you got those from. But for the moment, we'll open up the floor to any questions.
That's exciting. Thank you. That was really, really interesting. The main question I have is about like always stating your positionality. So like in this room, I can say that. There are plenty of other rooms where I would not say that. And like I'm not out to some of my family and people like that. So saying it publicly is not something that necessarily I have the privilege to do.
Yeah.
So what would you suggest in that situation? Because I imagine that's not unique to me. I imagine.
Yeah. So two things. So one of the ones I'd suggest there is obviously only say what you're comfortable saying. And when I say always state your positionality, that's again, if you have the, if you're able to do so, if you have that privilege, it's not going to make your work like worse, especially because, being honest, the kind of people who are going to positively engage with works on this topic are going to kind of probably understand that not everyone can, and understand where the author is going from. And equally, you can just kind of just say that you've like spoken to non-binary people, or you've read a lot of non-binary literature on this topic, if you want, or cite other papers that do. So basically what you could think of doing is finding a paper or a book chapter that has a definition of what you want to talk about, and you're just saying, after Margaret and Conkey, 1983, I am using this term in this way. So that might be one way of doing it. And the second thing on that point is that, unfortunately, if you're at a stage where you are publishing work on this topic, there are people out there who do not like that this is happening, and therefore, and this applies for everyone, is you do need to make sure that your positionality is something, everything in that has to be something you're comfortable with people knowing and finding out about you. Like I've had people send me AI generated images of skeletons with blue hair and then Photoshop me excavating them. I've had people send me pictures of desiccated chicken carcasses with the caption, "You'll never be a woman," because they know that I'm trans. Yeah, unfortunately it happens. So in your positionality, really think about what you're putting in there, and if you're what your audience is, who you're happy to have reading it, what's safe for you to declare. And if you can't do all of those things, cite someone who can and just say you agree with their definitions. You don't need to say why you agree with their definitions. You can just say, I agree with their definitions, and therefore that's the lexicon that I'm using, if that kind of answers your question.
And we have a couple of questions online. The first is from Brad Marshall. It's a two-part question. Given what you've discussed today, where do you think we're at in discussing archaeologies of gender and non-static identities across life courses and gendering in earlier stages such as childhood and adolescence?
Yes.
That's part one.
Yeah, so I'll answer that. That's a really good question that I didn't really get the chance to touch upon here, because the papers that I'm aware of that sort of talk into that haven't necessarily introduced new terminology, so they didn't make it into my whistle-stop tour. I think that is happening really productively in LBK archaeology, so linear bank ceramic archaeology. Penny Bickle is publishing stuff on that, and there is this discussion, and there's also, it's happening from both a gender and a sex point of view. I mean, one of the fascinating ones is kind of repetitive strain injuries of throwing javelins as evidence of ritualistic behavior. I think in to do with rites of initiation into manhood in the LBK, and also we're looking at burials and in terms of at what age gendered artifacts starts appearing and stuff like that. So I think archaeology is moving in that direction, and I think it's only going to be positive. And I think the joy of this is that everyone who's working on it, even if you 99% of people who are working on this, even if you disagree with them, they're usually arguing from a place that is meant to propel the discipline forward and be accepting of gender beyond a restricted binary. There's very few archaeologists, Fugas Flett is one of them, Ruth Whitehouse is another, who refuse to do that and are entrenched in that, no, there is a material culture of the penis and it makes you male, and a material culture of the vagina and it makes you female. That's it. There are very few archaeologists operating in that kind of restricted binary. So I say the future is bright, and it's certainly an area that isn't my focus, but there are people studying in it, and it can only benefit from more people coming in, either agreeing and expounding upon what's being done or challenging what's being done, but in a productive way.
And then part 2 is, why is the intersection of age and gender one of the latter concepts to gather interest and theoretical development? And in brackets, Brad has put, he promises he's not asking you to write his thesis.
So I think that has happened because society in large, and I'm not saying archaeology specifically, but society in large doesn't see human beings as children, doesn't see children as human beings a lot of the time. It kind of sees them as people that need to grow up and become human beings, and therefore they're not necessarily that interesting. And also, again, I think it similarly sees older people as not having the same kind of value. I think that's a problem with society, broader society, not necessarily archaeology. Although, if you look at how many archaeologies there are of funerary and burial context compared to birthing context, or how scant the archaeology of menstruation is, you'll realize that archaeology, through its tradition as being an antiquarian discipline and great man theory and finding all those artifacts, kind of its roots lay in the dead and the war. And those areas tend to preclude children and older people. And I think that's why they have become to this stage later, if that kind of broadly answers your question.
We've got another question online. So can you please comment further on the evolving definitions of trans-gender, transgender, and trans, such as used by trans scholars like Stryker in their serial published works over the last decade, as well as the DSM-4 and DSM-5 during this period?
Yeah, so for those who don't know, DSM-4 and DSM-5 are effectively medical definitions of what it means to be trans, and they relate it to having gender dysphoria, which, depending on who you ask, it exists or it doesn't. I'm of the view it doesn't exist and yet I have it, which is a real fun place to be. But effectively they pathologize transness, the DSMs, as a series of measurable, you are trans if you are significantly or suitably distressed in your gender, you are trans if you seek certain types of treatment, right? And DSM doesn't really have a place for non-binary people, because it's like, well, you can't be trans if you don't want to go the whole way, and they view it as that. They view non-binary as not wanting to go the whole way. So Stryker, in their series of work, kind of rages against this. I mean, quite literally, one of their works is Transgender Rage, my letter to Victor Frankenstein above the village of Samanoir, which is a fantastic paper. And they basically, you know, and them and kind of Sedgwick and Butler basically argue that trans is an identity that anyone can kind of embody. It's an identity that isn't inherently related to discomfort. You can have trans joy. It doesn't always need to be trans sorrow. And they kind of argue from this very this position of doing, right? To be trans is to just be trans and to enact transness. It's this idea of doing gender. And there's a lot of merit there. And archaeology, to their credit, basically looked at Butler, specifically Butler, less Stryker. And although Mary Westmantel published in an edited volume by Stryker, but that's here aside, and basically said, great, yes, we can view transness as a thing one does. And that's perfectly fine. And fortunately, I think because you can't read it archaeologically, it hasn't really gone down the DSM. Although it would have if it could have. And I know this because in 2000s, archaeology basically was like, the gay gene exists. what if we can dig up the gay gene? And basically argued that aDNA analysis can find out if people are gay. So I don't think it's for want of trying that archaeology has ignored the DSMs, but archaeology has ignored the DSMs and does lean, at least when we move into contemporary uses of the term in archaeology, into this idea that transness is a category of embodiment that one does. But equally, if we're viewing it as that kind of doing gender, that producing gender, and this is where we go back to stuff I mentioned in the answer to the question where I mentioned the LBK. It does mean that, again, you're only giving that identity to people who you think have met the threshold of sufficiently doing transness for a modern person to understand. And that means we get instances, or we could get instances, where a burial that doesn't, it's a male skeleton with male grave goods, that person could have not viewed themselves as a man, but we're not giving them that privilege because they have not done transgender correctly, which is why I think there's a lot of use in Stryker and Butler, and archaeology does use them, but we need to go beyond this concept of that gender is a performance and that you're doing gender. Gender is who you are and how you choose to express that, or how you choose not to express that, but it doesn't make you any less valid in your gender, and that might not be readable archaeologically, if that answers the question.
I think that's probably a really great place to leave that there. As usual, do join us at the Clarendon to continue on the conversation. I'm sure a lot of people in this room have a lot of thoughts. I know I definitely do. So thank you. As a reminder, we don't have a seminar next week as it is reading week. So join us again on the 25th of February, where we will have SK Marley talking about our transcapes, queering British prehistory for transgender wellbeing. So on the same theme, and also from the University of York. So
we're everywhere.
Quite fitting. And thank you to both our online and in-person audiences. And a final massive thank you to our speaker for an absolutely incredible talk.